All right, so Ian Griffiths is from Seamless Bay Area. He is their policy director and author of Governing Transit Seamlessly, Options for a Bay Area Transportation Network Manager. He has worked for a number of years prior to joining Seamless Bay Area as an urban and transportation planner, and as he told us at lunch, at many different spaces, in consulting, so the private sector and the public sector. For BART, I believe it was that you mentioned. And then he says AECOM, Perkins and Will, and he oversaw the development of BART's station experience design guidelines. And so today he's going to tell us broadly about the work that Seamless Bay Area is doing, and maybe a little bit towards the end of how we can be helpful to them. And if we don't get into that too much in Transit Lab, if any of you who don't typically join us want to join, we're going to talk a little bit about how our research might actually help inform some of the topics that they do at Seamless Bay Area. So with that, Ian, you want to start?
Great. Well, thanks for having me. I'll talk a little bit of just my background, and then I'll go into the content. And Carrie mentioned a little bit of my background, but yeah, I'm an urban planner. I'm Canadian originally, and I moved out to California for UC Berkeley's master's program in city planning. So I moved to California in 2005. Here almost 20 years. Yes, there's 20, close to that. And I started, actually I didn't study, secret is I did not study transportation planning. I studied urban design, but I kind of moved my way into transportation planning. I took a couple of courses in transportation planning. That's my specialty though, when I was at UC. And worked in different sectors. I had the opportunity to move back to Canada in 2012, and that's really where I shifted into transit and started working for Metrolinx, which is the regional transportation authority for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, which is very similar to the Bay Area in terms of population. It's about 8 million, lots of transit agencies, and that's really where I kind of piqued my interest in transit and the challenges created from having many different agencies, particularly on capital projects and multimodal stations, because that was my job, was working on these big station projects that were connecting multiple modes, and realizing that so much of the difficulty of achieving a seamless system was rooted in having different organizations and having sort of the institutional structure. And had the opportunity to work at that time for Metrolinx at a time where that agency had been recently set up. It was taking on really big, important work, doing policymaking that was setting up a very grand vision of what the system could be, and implementing, there's probably more transit under construction right now in Toronto than anywhere else in North America. Really exciting time, great job. I moved back to the Bay Area for personal reasons, and that's when I started working at BART. And the contrast of moving from a government agency that was thinking very far out into the future and had a very clear vision of how to create an improved transit system that was going to attract more people, and then coming back to the Bay Area and finding myself working for a great agency. I have positive things to say about BART, but it was so evident to me at the time that what was missing in the Bay Area was there was no institution and no agency that was really leading. There was, the more BART obviously is just running the rail system, but looking at MTC, the region's MPO, the agency that you would expect would be advancing, a vision of an integrated system and promoting some of these policy ideas that were so obvious for any rider that uses transit. Of like a huge barrier to using transit in the Bay Area is the sheer complexity and the lack of connectivity and having so many different systems. And the more I asked around, the more I think there was just this widely acknowledged acceptance that this is a huge problem, but that no one's working on it. And there was a real need for advocacy in that space. And the story, a little bit of how Seamless Bay Area came to exist was, the other thing to acknowledge is, so there's an advocacy group called SPUR in the Bay Area, long-standing civic research institution that wrote a report in 2015 called Seamless Transit. And it was a report that on all the things the Bay Area could do to make a more seamless integrated public transit system without actually building new lines, but just by improving the customer experience and improving connectivity of the existing systems we had. And at the time, this was right when I was moving back to the Bay Area. Everyone in the region was like, this is the best plan ever. This is the most brilliant white paper. This is the future. This is exactly the direction we have to go in. And then, but 2 or 3 years after it was written, we were asking those questions. You know, I was in my network. We were like, "What happened to this plan? Everyone was so excited about it. Who's moving it forward?" And the response we got from Spur was like, "We get asked that every day. I wish we had a better answer for you." You know, and we asked the question, you know, do we need a group that builds the political will to actually move this forward? Because it's going to require a social movement, you know, convincing elected officials. You know, this is the right vision, but it seems like there's a missing advocacy piece to bring it into reality. And that's really, and the response we got was extremely positive from Spur, from Transform, from other advocacy groups that already were existing. Everyone said, this is a really important issue for public transit, but we don't see our own organization as bringing it on. So, but if there's a group that wants to emerge that's going to take this on, we'll be with you. So that's where I kind of co-founded Seamless Bay Area and met some of the other advocates that also co-founded Seamless Bay Area, many of whom worked for other transit agencies. I was at BART at the time, but one of our, you know, people at MTC, people working at other agencies, and people working in the advocacy space that really co-founded Seamless. And our vision is to, obviously, our mission is to transform the Bay Area system into an integrated and widely used system by both building a diverse movement for change, so it's the grassroots work that's involved in bringing about that change, but also promoting the policy reforms and including doing the research and having a really strong policy grounding for how to actually accomplish that vision of an integrated system. Our vision of a seamless system, we believe requires, or components of that include coordinated transit fares, scheduled branding and service to have an easy to use system that just makes transit a much easier, more competitive choice. We need faster, more frequent, and more reliable transit service. So we know we don't have enough transit. We just need to run more buses and trains. Like, that is an essential piece. It's not just by making it seamless that we are going to transform it. We really need overall higher levels of service when we look at regions around the world that have far higher rates of transit use. So we need more funding for transit, and that's part of our official kind of vision as well. And importantly, and something that we care a lot about, is the governance. And so to accomplish this, we also need a regional network authority, a governance entity that can unify 27 fragmented systems. This doesn't come about by accident. It has to be led by an empowered public institution. So I'll try to, I'll go through this relatively quickly. I think prior to the pandemic, transit in the Bay Area was not going, it was sort of stagnant, or in some cases declining. It depends on the system, but overall transit ridership was kind of steadily going down. There was a little bit of an increase, I think, between 2016 and beyond, as you know, BART and Caltrain kind of increased, but overall the trend over the past couple of decades leading up to the pandemic was slow, despite huge growth in the region. Transit, fewer people were taking transit per capita, buses were slowing down. We did a lot of early work just going out to the public, going out to farmers markets and going out to different public events, talking to people, and we heard over and over the same thing, many of the same ideas, which is that people actually want to use transit. A lot of just ordinary people in the Bay Area are really open to using transit. It's not like they're against using it, but so often it just doesn't make sense for them because it's just not reliable enough. It takes too long. They don't understand how to use it, or it's too confusing, or they had a bad experience once and they just don't want to take the risk again. So a lot of these same things, versus I think in other regions, in other parts of the country, you could have maybe some more cultural barriers to using transit. But in the Bay Area, I think there's a real appetite for transit. It's just people so often don't choose it because it doesn't make sense for them. And of course, transit, and the fact that the Bay Area's transit system, despite being one of the highest ridership systems in California, it's still pretty low, you know, for I think what it could be, and compared to other kind of comparable regions in other parts of the world. So the poorly performing transit system, which I mainly think ridership is the main metric that I'm thinking about, that assessment of it is, it hurts. Like, all the biggest challenges in the Bay Area are sort of wrapped up in that, including, of course, congestion and the pollution from that, but also there are housing affordability challenges in the Bay Area. You can access the housing, transit is access to housing, and less effective transit means fewer affordable housing options. So another kind of indication that the transit network isn't living up, or it's punching below its weight of what it should be, is when you think about the density of the Bay Area and you compare it to the transit ridership. And this data is a little bit old. It's from like 2000 to 2006, but it's from a book called Transport for Suburbia. That's really an excellent book. But one of the things the really powerful things is it really shows how US regions kind of compare unfavorably to Canadian and Australian regions, which are more similar than, say, European regions in terms of the land use profile. Like, they're very sprawl. There's a lot of sprawl. There's a lot of, they urbanized in the same era as the United States. But Australian and Canadian cities have much higher rates of transit use, and even the Bay Area is an outlier when, considering its density and its regional density. It should have much higher transit use if it was on this trend line. It should be somewhere around Toronto levels of transit, but it's really got much lower transit use than it should, and I think that's related both to the way that the service is operated, as well as just not having enough service overall, not running the service hours that are needed to attract larger amounts of transit riders. So the region is there are 27 transit agencies in the Bay Area, and this fragmentation is one of the contributors to why the transit system is not working for people. It attracts, prior to the pandemic, about 5 or 6% of all trips were taken on transit. That translated to about 12% of commute trips. We care less about commute trips, I imagine, now, because commuting is way less common than it used to be. So I hope we're moving more towards just overall percentage of all trips as a metric. There's very little coordination, and there's no really official adopted regional vision for transit in the Bay Area, which may seem shocking, but it's the truth. Riders face a number of barriers, obviously, in navigating, in paying, in using systems, planning trips. And now in this era of COVID, each of these 27 transit agencies is individually struggling, having to make decisions around which lines to keep, which ones to cut, what services to offer. And this is making it even more perilous, I think, for riders to sort of navigate and try to continue to use transit. And another thing, just as an indication that we feel like the system needs change, is we've spent a lot of money on transit over the past many years, particularly on capital investments, on extensions, on new projects, and we haven't seen an increase in ridership. So we're investing a lot of capital dollars in these projects, and we're not seeing an increase in ridership. And I think that's also related to just the way we're planning out the system. So now in the pandemic area, we have one of the slowest rates of ridership regrowth in the country here in the Bay Area. So I know this is November, it's actually not much higher than this right now, maybe a little higher, but it's about 55% of pre-pandemic ridership in the Bay Area compared to before. And that is, I think, the lowest in the country. At a regional level, I think even within the Bay Area, San Jose and San Francisco specifically are the bottom, even lower than that. And that is related to a number of factors. The economy, I think, of the Bay Area is one reason. A lot of white collar jobs and a lot of just industries that were able to go fully remote and are happy to continue to be either fully remote or more remote than in other parts of the country. So we have a particularly acute challenge right now in the Bay Area, and a need to kind of capture a different type of transit rider and a different type of transit trip, whereas previously our transit system was heavily oriented around commute trips, and those trips are not coming back. Many of those trips are just not ever going to come back. And recovering from the pandemic, we need to actually not just recover what we had prior to the pandemic, we have to do better. We have to attract more than 5 or 6% of riders to transit if we have any hope of meeting our statewide climate goals. And our statewide, our very lauded goals of ambitious climate goals of reducing GHG by 80% They rely off of, and this is a recent scoping plan that the Air District of California or Air Resources Board adopted. They say in order to achieve these goals, and particularly of reducing transportation emissions, the largest source of emissions, we have to decrease vehicle miles traveled by 25% below 2019 levels by 2045. And you can see, oh, where's the laser? Here we go. So this has been the trend of VMT up until 2019. And yeah, we need to be 25% below that. So we're still going up, in terms of VMT. And there's no way that VMT goes down if transit ridership is not going up. So transit ridership has to be, or walking, biking, transit, all of those need to be going up. There needs to be mode shift in order to achieve that. So the idea that we can have any chance of meeting our climate goals with not even like as good of a transit system as we had, but we need to very much change the way our transit system is performing statewide. But I think for the Bay Area specifically. Okay, I'm going to skip this one. I already talked about housing. Transit makes housing cheaper to build. Basically, you don't have to provide a switch parking. It's got all sorts of other benefits, and it's connected to, as I mentioned before, our affordability challenges. So this is a map that we created. This is on our website. We created this map. This is our vision map, not necessarily as a we have costed out every single project on this thing, but this is a vision of really how we ought to be planning the network. You don't see agencies. You should have all modes integrated, consistent service levels across the Bay Area, or at least service standards for relative to density, and regional buses, local buses, trains, ferries, all connecting in a highly logical, connected way. We created this map to really show the potential of, if we actually plan transit like this, and actually if we presented it to the rider, how would that transform how people view the ease of using transit? If you've ever been to London, or if you've been to city where you just look at the metro map and you all of a sudden see all the places that you can get to, because you know that every line on that map is associated with frequent, reliable, on-time service. We need to have a map and a plan, first of all, a plan for building out that type of system. And then we need to have the map and the customer information that actually kind of communicates that level of connectivity and ease of using transit to the rider. Right now, people are, even just to navigate one system, people often find it very overwhelming to try to understand how transit works within a system, let alone trying to connect and plan between multiple systems. So a seamless regional network, in our view, is one that is strategically planned at the regional level to actually work as a system. That isn't planned on an agency by agency level, but planned as an entire network. The way our freeway system, to be totally honest, is planned that way at a national level. But where transit agencies, and we may continue to have many of them, but they work together such that their boundaries are invisible to the user, and they're working in the same way to operate an integrated network. That requires service quality, schedules, wayfinding, signage, basically, to be standardized, simple, and as reliable as possible for the end user. And where, as I mentioned, we do need more funding overall for the increased levels of service. That's part of the solution as well. So thinking about institutions and how we actually deliver such a vision. We've done a lot of research on this, and we've partnered with the Minnesota Transportation Institute and other research institutions looking at actually how does this type of network get delivered in other parts of the world. And what we have found, and what the research shows, is that there's a common institutional structure that is associated with a seamless integrated system, and we call this a transportation network manager entity. That's sort of our generic term. It's, in some research, it's called a regional transit coordinating entity. I think that's in this particular Mineta report that I'm going to mention on the next page. That's what they refer to it as. In Germany, they call these Verkehrsverbünde. In regions with just more consolidated agencies, they don't really have a name for it. It's just the transit agency that happens to cover the entire region. So we use the term transportation network manager entity to describe a regional entity that oversees core common parts of the transit network as a whole, and provides accountability for the network as a whole. And typically they house these core functions of the transit system at a regional scale: long-range planning, fare policy, service standards, the backbone schedules, customer experience, branding data, and in some cases, capital project delivery. And they can coexist with having multiple agencies, but generally the local agencies, there's a clear division of responsibilities between the network manager and what the local agencies do. And the local agencies are oftentimes more focused on, the specific operations maintenance, the things that don't require necessarily the same degree of regional coordination and consistency. And these are some of the examples of in other regions. They're all slightly different. They're not all equally effective, but there's different models of how this works in domestically and internationally. It can be done by recognizing that we have different local funding sources, which is a big issue in California. We have a lot of county sales taxes, local measures that are funding transit, and particularly in Germany, and Switzerland, this is also a common feature, and yet they still have seamless transit. So it is possible, and this type of structure is the norm in regions with high transit ridership. And so this is a study that, speaking of research opportunities, Mineta Transportation Institute, they kind of came to us like, is there a research project you want to do? And we said, we'd love to do just research on high-performing transit regions, looking at the regional scale and thinking of what are the common institutional factors in those regions. And so these were the regions that were selected, mostly trying to get like similar sized regions to the Bay Area, not necessarily the capital cities, and also regions that had high transit ridership, and in some cases a closer like land use profile to the Bay Area. And you can see here all very high ridership regions in terms of, remember our region is like I should say, the Bay Area has 6% of overall trips on transit. These are all significantly higher. And these are the different functions that are done at the regional scale by a regional network manager type of entity. So you can see a remarkable degree of similarity that they're doing regional, they're planning at the network level, they have affairs determined at the network level, schedule coordination, in many cases, common marketing, common procurement. So not exactly the same, but a lot of similarity. In terms of, do they directly run the transit? There's actually a split in terms of about half of these regional entities do directly just operate the system. And in many of them, particularly the German examples or in Italy as well, there's a lot of different operators. So the operations are actually done separately from this regional entity. So to compare that to the area, you can see very low ridership, and we do almost none of these things at the regional scale. So, and we have MTC. There's some discussion at lunch about what does MTC do? Why don't they do these things? Could they do these things? Like that's the magic question for the Bay Area. But we are not doing. There's a lot of coordination going on. There's a lot of meetings. There's a lot of regional forums. There's not a lot of actual. There's very little that's actually done at this regional scale, and that's the structural issue that we need to address if we're going to improve transit in the region. So, as one specific example to compare to the Bay Area, Greater Frankfurt, little smaller population, lots of municipalities, lots of different transit operators, 160 in fact, polycentric region. There's, like the Bay Area, they don't have a big body of water in the middle, but it's a complex region with a lot of suburban and urban areas, a lot of highways also. There was a federal legislation in Germany that caused some German regions actually created a network manager much earlier, where Frankfurt was actually one of the later regions to adopt, to create the RMV was the institution that they created in 1993. There was a result of federal legislation that required some level of regional coordination as a condition for receiving federal money. And so that MRV was created in 1995. And basically their growth in transit ridership between 1996 and 2017 was 60% growth in transit ridership. At the same period of time, we had 16% growth in the Bay Area. Their transit mode share is now 19% compared to our 4%. So, it's not just like, my point here is there's probably more conducive density in Frankfurt. There's a number of different factors, but I think this growth, this trajectory that they're on, and that particularly in Europe and in Germany, they've seen they've seen, they're moving in the right direction, and that's, I think, very much related to a lot of the growth in their regions have also been in these exurban areas, or not exurban, but like outer areas. And that's similarly to where a lot of the growth has been occurring in our region, except for we haven't been providing transit. You know, as we continue to grow out, those areas are not transit rich. We set up a unique transit agency just for these outlying areas, and that's not as competitive. So I want to do a little bit of a dive into to fare specifically, which is an area we've looked. There's a lot going on in the Bay Area on fare policy. So I'll just highlight some of the progress here, and then I'll move to, okay, good, we're actually on time. Kind of the other kind of areas where we're making some progress in some of the recent initiatives in the Bay Area. So having different fares and complicated fare structure is a big barrier to more people using transit, and it's also an equity issue in terms of how much people are paying. And so we have 20 different, there's every type of fare structure in the Bay Area among our 27 different transit agencies. There's zone-based fares, there's distance-based fares, there's flat fares, there's different transfer policies. Local fares vary anywhere between $1.50 and $2.50. And the Clipper, which is the system of payment, there's so many different combinations of trips that it's a very complex system to administer in terms of every scenario that has to be plugged into Clipper. It makes it a very expensive system to actually like update. So it's complex for riders. It's inequitable in the sense that if you have to take a trip using multiple modes, you are penalized financially. So if you are lucky enough to live near a BART station, if your work and your home is near a BART station, you get a cheaper fare than if you have to take a bus to BART and take BART and then take another bus. And that, even though you might be going the same distance. And to me, that's an inequitable outcome that people shouldn't be penalized just because, I mean, it is more expensive to live near a BART station. So why aren't we pricing transit to kind of reflect the fact that like we need to be serving people more equitably? It's inefficient. Obviously, the Clipper is one way in which that manifests, and it's not aligned with our environmental goals. So it actually, in some cases, will make transit more expensive than driving, especially if you're in a group. So if you're a family of 4, I mean, very quickly, your cost for transit is going to exceed your cost for parking and gas or bridge tolls. So it's not sending the right incentive to people financially. And all of that contributes to low transit use. So as an advocacy strategy, we released a vision map of what a more integrated, effective, simple fare system would be. And this is our fare vision map, which is a zone-based map, the way that's very common in Germany and Switzerland, that essentially breaks up the region into zones, and you basically just count the number of zones and note that you're between your origin and your destination, and that determines your fare. And it doesn't matter which way you get there or how many agencies you take. Your fare is calculated based on approximately how far you're going, and that all discounts apply uniformly on all agencies, having fare capping such that if you take transit a certain number of times per month, you don't have to buy the monthly pass in advance. You just get the benefit of a loyalty pass automatically. So I was going to actually demonstrate that with this website that you can check. I will, in the interest of time, you can go to that website and compare your fare if you with this system versus our current system. And this skipped over. Let's see. So I'll just sticking with fare. So this was all directed towards a fare integration study that was just kicking off at the time that we released this our vision, trying to influence this study to make sure that it incorporated, like it was looking at some of these big ideas like a zone-based structure. So we made some progress. Now I'm getting to the part of the presentation where we're talking about progress, not just problems, and some of the things that are underway. So we have been able to get fare integration onto the agenda of our regional agencies and MTC in particular So this fare coordination and integration study got kicked off right before the pandemic, studying, what could reforms to our fare system and reducing some of these barriers, could this have an impact on ridership? And is it worth proceeding with those policies? And the result was the adoption of these. They found, yes, there is a case to be made for integrated fares can increase transit ridership. And the 3 initiatives that they specifically recommended moving forward with were a and all agency transit pass that basically right now you can purchase a pass that's just good on AC Transit, or you can purchase this Unipass that's just good on one agency. Our region didn't until recently have a pass that you can purchase that's good, for unlimited trips over the whole month on all the agencies. So that has been introduced right now in a pilot forum called Bay Pass, and it's available to 50,000 students. And it's showing very positive ridership results. And the hope is that the plan is to have it be available to any member of the public soon. Free transfers was another, free and reduced cost transfers between agencies was found to be a highly cost-effective policy that would generate up to 25,000 new transit trips a day, have big EMT reduction benefits, very reasonable cost per new rider. And the other policy that was recommended as highly effective was creating a common regional fare structure for the regional services, which include Caltrain, BART, ferry, express buses. So not the local services, but getting those longer distance services on the same fare structure. And that had the biggest ridership benefit of up to 68,000 new transit trips per day. So these were the policies that were adopted, and but unfortunately, something that was not resolved is how do you implement these policies? Like, how do you actually govern these policies? And in particularly with the regional standard fare, right now, essentially proceeding with any of these policies depends on all these agencies individually consenting to go towards this regional structure. So if one agency decides they don't want to do it, you don't have a consistent fare structure. So that's where governance kind of comes into this conversation. Right now, there's agreement on it, but who's to say the next board won't change their mind and be like, we think we're getting the short end of the stick, so we're going to go create our own fare structure. So I just had a couple. These are from the slides that just were on Monday. I was mentioning it to someone at lunch that just some of the really interesting data on the Bay Pass, this multi-agency pass that they're piloting, and some of the really promising results that are coming out of that. So these are, it's being piloted with 4 universities or colleges: UC Berkeley, San Jose State, San Francisco State, and Santa Rosa Junior College. And right now, those students, previously, most students receive just a single agency pass. So Berkeley students get an AC Transit pass. San Jose State students get a BTA pass. This is paid for in their student fees. San Francisco gets they have like a Gator pass that actually gives them some access to BART, but not all. It's a little confusing. So the pilot, Bay Pass, basically says for that same price of what you pay in your student fees, we're giving you a multi-agency pass that gives you unlimited access to all Bay Area transit. And so that's funded by MTC. It's not how you price it ultimately, but like it's an experiment. And they've mostly it's, a portion of the students are still getting this pass. And then some, I think 25 or 50% of the students are receiving this different pass. So they're able to collect data on how is this affecting transit use. And what they find, not shockingly, is that there's a significant increase in transit use across all of the areas, and actually didn't include more. Sorry, there's other interesting slides in this deck, but one of the interesting, so it's between 30, I think the average increase is 35% increase in transit trips during this period between August 19th and April 7th, so over 6 months. And what's really interesting is that there's an increase including on the same agency that they had the pass on before. So Berkeley students who have the multi-agency pass are using AC Transit more than the students that just have the AC Transit pass. So I think the fear, this is important because I think the fear is like, oh, well, if you give someone access to a transit pass, then it'll mean they'll ride the original agency less because they'll replace, they might go to BART, say, like thinking about, oh, if you all of a sudden have free access to BART, you might not take AC Transit as much, you might take BART all the time. Well, they're finding people who have the multi-agency pass are also they're using BART a lot more, but they're also using AC Transit more. They're using and that's true in all of the examples. So really interesting pilot and a strong data for making the case to extend this. So I'll get to, okay, so where are we now? Back to the fair stuff. So in terms of progress in building, so the advocacy and the change that needs to happen to create a more integrated system and bring about that network manager and bring about the funding that we need to have a more integrated system. So we are building that grassroots support by one of the strategies we're using to build this broad grassroots coalition of groups and elected officials is something called the Seamless Transit Principles, which are 7 very basic principles around, run all Bay Area transit as one BCP system, put riders first, make transit equitable and accessible to all. So it's in the form of a resolution that a city or a company or a transit agency can adopt to really adopt a policy stance that's saying that this is the vision, these are the policies we support, and that's been a really important way of building broad support for these policies, and particularly engaging a lot of the locally elected officials that I think many people would assume might be like their predisposition would be, protect local control, but in fact, if you ask them, well, should we have a transit system? Many of them agree, and they say, yes, we should. So having them adopt the Seamless Transit Principles has been a way of us building political support at the local and at the state level for change. We've also been working on state legislation, three attempts now since 2020. And while none of these bills have passed, each one has created more momentum and a lot of widespread support and positive media coverage for this issue. So I would say they've been successes, even though they haven't become law. So our very first bill, AB 2057, with Assemblymember David Chu, was to create a blue ribbon task force that really would have studied this issue around how should we reform governance in the Bay Area to achieve a more integrated system. Well, that was 2020, so COVID, no bills moved forward. Very few bills moved forward that year. That was the bill that actually led to the region choosing to set up something called the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force, and having a specific focus on governance change in that bill. So that was an outcome of that specific bill. And then more recently, the most recent 2 attempts have been to try to commit transit agencies to proceeding with certain aspects of fair integration, like free transfers, setting timelines and deadlines for the adoption of common wayfinding and real-time data standards. So not addressing the overall governance issue, but trying to at least make sure that these initiatives don't drag on and needlessly forever and aren't reliant on 27 independent entities voting in favor of something that everyone in theory, when there's been agreement on something, we need to be able to move forward expeditiously with this program. So we've been able to build very strong, this is universally popular among the public. So there's been polling, this was polling associated with the most recent, one of the bills, AB 629. So basically, universal support, this is what the public wants. So this is why I think there's a lot of momentum around this, particularly in Sacramento. People say, this is not a controversial issue among the average member of the public. That Blue Ribbon Task Force that I mentioned got kicked off during the pandemic. That has led to that was a 32-member task force that was created with the general managers of 10 of the largest agencies in the Bay Area, about a third advocacy groups. I sat on that task force, and then a third elected officials approximately, and then a few state officials like the Secretary of Transportation at the time, David Chu, from the state legislature, was on it. So this plan, which is the result of that Blue Ribbon Task Force, is called the Bay Area Transit Transformation Action Plan, and it's got 27 actions in it, and it's basically a kind of blueprint for the direction I think that Seamless wants the region to go in. It's committing us to this vision of a seamless system, and it breaks that down into integrated fares, integrated branding and wayfinding service, more funding, and accessibility, improved accessibility as well. And it kicked off so there's a number of initiatives that are now moving forward as a result of that transformation action plan, including the fair integration work. That fair integration work is already underway, but this kind of gave it even more momentum to move forward. Okay, talk about fair integration. So another initiative that's moving forward as a result of that Blue Ribbon Task Force plan that was adopted is something called the Connected Network Plan. So basically, this is an exercise to actually design a service vision for integrated transit and actually make all of our routes and the long range service and capital planning for our region add up to a coherent network, which again is not historically how the Bay Area has done regional planning. The way we've done regional planning in the past is each agency on their own is like, okay, what are the capital improvements we want to make? What are the bus lines we want to invest in? And MTC, when they do their regional RTP update, which they call my Bay Area, every 5 years they say, okay, transit agencies, what are your projects? Give us your projects. And everyone submits their projects and they sort of evaluate them. They have a bunch of metrics, they feed them into this big model, and then they like sort of staple them all together and they say, okay, here's our regional plan. So this is a very different approach to regional planning, which is to say, we're going to start with a network. We're going to start with what is the system we should have, and then, sorry, these are images from their prior planning processes. So Connected Network Plan, it's really more the Swiss approach. So this is the country, Switzerland, has really kind of perfected this process at a national scale for how they design their rail and transit networks, which is thinking about like being able to get to the most number of places across the country and designing the infrastructure to be able to support as much connectivity between all places as possible. And they like famous for their sort of clock-based schedules in informing their rail planning and the infrastructure that actually supports this type of service. So these are some diagrams from how they sort of at a countrywide scale. And the country of Switzerland is not too far off from the Bay Area in terms of size. So even though it seems odd to compare an entire country to the Bay Area, it's actually the same population, and Switzerland is actually bigger than the Bay Area, but if you just focus in on the most urbanized part of Switzerland, that probably is more similar, pretty similar in size to the Bay Area geographically. So, and then here's an example from Seattle, also of a service-based vision for like having very clear, like identifying what are the hubs within a region and starting from the point of how long should it take us to get between these key hubs? How can we make that competitive with driving? And then like use that to identify where should we have rail? Where should we have high capacity, have frequent service? Which of those corridors, rather than saying just 27 agencies, where do you think there should be transit? I mean, that's part of it too. I'm not saying the transit agencies don't have good ideas as to where there should be transit, but you're not going to have a network that adds up to an integrated system. So lastly, and I will take questions. I'm almost done here. Lastly, on the governance piece. So where are we on the governance piece? There's some good progress moving forward with FAIRS and with network planning, but on this question of a network manager and this fundamental reform that we think is needed to get to that more seamless system. There's different models of a network manager in different parts of the world, and some of this came out of that research. You have models where there's a network manager entity that doesn't directly run any transit, but coordinates a lot of local agencies. These examples like Frankfurt is that. At the other end of this spectrum, you have a network manager that actually directly operates all of the transit, and like TransLink or Stockholm, Vancouver or Stockholm are examples of that. And then you have, in the middle, you have systems where like the network manager runs the regional service, but all the local service is done by local agencies. In Toronto, I know that model fairly well because that's where I worked in Toronto. So all of them can work, all of them can lead to high ridership, but the common thing is you have this network manager entity that does certain core regional functions, as I was mentioning. So where we're at on that is we did this Blue Ribbon Task Force led to this long study where we hired an external consultant, and the long and the short of it is after a year, and this was largely due to the opposition of the transit agencies that made up the steering committee for the study. Their recommendation was no legislation, a framework that relies entirely off of voluntary coordination. So I don't think this is this is not a network manager. This is not what we see in other parts of the world as leading to those outcomes. It's extremely fragile. It relies off of a whole bunch of independent general managers who are accountable to different boards agreeing by consensus. So it provides a little bit of a better it provides some more structure and organization to what we already do, and that's a step in the right direction, but well, I won't explain this fully, we can go back to it if there's questions, but essentially what this has unfortunately led to is not the scale of change that we need to deliver an integrated system. So there's more work to be done on the governance front. It's very disappointing that this study that was supposed to, in my view, lead to, well, which of these three options is the right option for the Bay Area? Instead, it said none of these options. In fact, we can just get there by more coordination.
Who authored that study?
The study was led by MTC, so like they were the client, and the consultant team. I don't know. Was your question what agency led it, or who was the consulting team that worked on it? Both. So the consulting team was. A little bit of drama there. The prime consultant was called Via Architecture. They had a lot of subs on their team. The initial sub during the first part of the contract was a company called Access Planning, which is a Canadian firm that I have a lot of respect for, and I was very happy got selected for the project. But due to them, essentially, this is the tea. This is the this is what really happened that you won't read about, but I will just tell you because. But they were proposing things that the agencies were not comfortable with, and they were looking at these options, and because the steering committee was made up of majority general managers, they said, we're not, that is not what you're hired to do, you can't do this, and they got them kind of taken off the project. And as a result, a different sub-consultant on the team, KPMG, which is an accounting firm, which had a small part of the project, but then they were like, oh, you do all of it now. And this is what they came up with. So it's a group, they have some transit experience, but they're not experts in governance. And they had a billing rate that was twice the rate of the other consultants. And they basically told the transit agencies exactly what they wanted to hear, right? Like that, which is that, oh, well, what are you comfortable doing? Okay, well, we'll put that in the plan. That's what happened. But yeah, the consultancy goes through. So our work continues. Another disappointing thing was, that bill, our most recent attempt at a bill, got killed by, basically lobbying from some of the transit agencies. Even though it was fully funded, even though it wouldn't have created a cost burden upon them, it said if MTC identifies funding for fare integration and for wayfinding, and if they've fully costed it out, and those costs are verified by the transit agencies, it's a lot of amendment language to make this bill acceptable. And even despite all of that, so the bill said if it's fully costed out, then MTC can require free transfers, for example. Well, actually, specifically, that was one of the things that they were allowed to require, and transit agencies have to do it, and they don't get to decide to opt out. That was basically what the bill said, and that got killed because people not wanting to give up control, I think, is at the end of the day. This is disrupting the existing kind of way things are done and who holds power, and that's at the heart of why this is such a difficult issue to confront, and why we need advocacy groups like ours to work on it. So, and why riders need to speak up. So I think speaking to you as like individuals, advocacy really matters. That's my kind of professional, like having worked in this field for a long time. Like change happens sometimes from the inside, but sometimes it's hard for change to happen from staff, and that riders really, speaking up makes a difference. So wrapping up here, I realize I've taken longer. But we're in this very acute challenge right now with finances of public transit and the fiscal cliff, which you, I'm sure, have heard about, where transit agencies, particularly in the Bay Area, are running out of money because ridership has gone way down. We were very reliant on fares, especially BART and SFMTA, UD, and ridership has been recovering slowly, but it's probably not. It's going to take a long time for it to ever get beyond what it was at before the pandemic, and due to the change in behavior, we have to be redesigning the system to attract new markets of riders, because a lot of those commuters are not coming back. But there are a lot of people traveling. Traffic is back on the bridges. Like, people are going places. They're just not going to the same places that they used to, and transit can carry those trips. I think we see in other regions that have more integrated systems that transit, like Vancouver as an example, I think it's up to 85% of pre-pandemic ridership in the region of Vancouver, and they have a much more anywhere to anywhere system that works for all types of trips. That's the type of network that's going to be the most resilient to changes in the future, and that's going to be most competitive for private cars. So we're doing a lot of advocacy to try to get money out of the state budget right now to make sure we don't have to make service cuts. But legislators are calling for reforms. They're saying, what are you going to do to ensure that like get onto a path to sustainability? So the near-term solution in terms of funding is we really just urgently need money to keep the lights on right now with transit and keep buses going. But the longer-term solution, which is a regional ballot measure in the Bay Area, and so that's something that we've been working on as part of a coalition for quite some time. We needed a new funding source prior to the pandemic to get to those higher service levels that in other parts of the world have resulted in higher ridership, but now we need it just to survive, just to sort of replace the lost revenue. And we also hopefully can increase service levels as well. I'll just end by talking about a regional measure. So this is something that we're working on that I think the discussions right now are putting it on the ballot in 2026 is the preference, but that still does rely off of getting money out of the state budget in the near term. We feel very strongly that this is a big opportunity to pair those governance and structural reforms with that ballot measure. And when we look at other regions of the world, including Seattle, Zurich, Montreal, that's how the change has occurred. It's when there's this new money coming in, that's the opportunity to say, okay, you don't just get new money with no strings attached. You have to proceed with these reforms. So we're trying to build the case for that, build the political allies to make that happen. And I think it's going well, but it's going to be a lot of work, and that's where a lot of our work is focused right now, is ensuring that, and there's certainly a lot of interest, but I think it continues to be. So just to end here with a timeline, we are here in 2023. This was the Blue Ribbon Task Force, the fair integration study that all happened. That led to this network management business case that was very disappointing, as I mentioned. There's been a few other studies going on looking at consolidations of agencies. We're looking at legislation and change to really set up a network manager in the next 2 years, not this legislative cycle, but in the future. We need funding out of the state budget this year to really bridge us to the year when we can advance a regional measure, the hope is we'll need some kind of enabling other legislation to put something on the ballot. Where the plan is to pass that in 2024. MTC and our other agencies are working on that, and hopefully we set ourselves up for success in the 2026 or 2028 timeframe for the funding and the reforms and the seamless transit system nirvana that comes from that. So anyway, that's it for my slides. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for all your work. Like food goals, especially with the experience of the study, the consultants, it's very clear a power dynamic issue. I mean, there's much more to it, right? We were talking about this in class also. Any attempts or outlook into like a state, like calls that, like state transportation agency to govern? Because it seems like as you mentioned, culture, right? Me of mine. So it's not gonna.
I skipped over. It's funny. You asked a question about the slide that I sort of skipped over, but so yeah, there's been a lot of, the state is very interested, I think, in this topic, in terms of promoting integration within all the regions of California. I wish the state would pass a policy where they're like, they condition state money to regional integration, right? Like, or like, so I think there's a lot the state could do. I think the state, I don't know why this is, but like, I think your Cal ITP, which is this integrated travel project, like they've done a lot of great work in this developing standards for payment. But they haven't made that mandatory. You know, they've said, well, this is a resource that everyone can use, but we're not going to make it a requirement. So that's kind of the role that the state has been playing, is they've been doing a lot of good work, but they have been somewhat hands-off. They've been trying to sort of let the regions decide how to best coordinate things. But this bill, AB 761, from Laura Friedman, is in the state legislature. It's called the Transit Transformation Task Force. She introduced the same bill last year, but it unfortunately had to be repurposed for a different use. So the purpose of this bill is to kind of do what we did in the Bay Area, but at a statewide scale, to take a step back on transit across the state and look at governance, look at long-term funding, and look at the outcomes, and to try to identify, first of all, what role should the state play? Like, should the state play a more hands-on, helpful role in assisting regions or directly overseeing some parts of the transit system itself, like housing some of those functions at the state level? So yeah, I think this is, I hope this bill passes. We support this bill, and I hope this sets off more. I think this would help Caltrans, CalSTA, who might want to move in this direction, but feel like they don't necessarily have the political buy-in to do that. I think this task force is an opportunity to create that clear policy coming from legislators saying this is the role the state should play, which is a greater role than they had historically. That'd be extremely welcome, and it's something that you look at Germany, if you look at these other countries, like, again, I think Germany is, those European countries are roughly analogous to California given the state scale, right, as opposed to the US federal government. Like, I think it's appropriate for California to become much more demanding of, you know, like set standards and be more proactive in expectations around transit.
So you mentioned the users, and so I wanted to know what information do you know or you have about users really supporting this, and how have you gotten it, and does that same information do the agencies have that information? Do they collect information from their interests in getting more like integrated fare payments? So that's one thing, and then my other question would be like, what information or data or studies would you need to support this kind of bills that maybe could be something of interest for us?
So one source of information has been polling, and this is not exactly polling, it's not done only for transit users, it's also done for all members of the population. So the poll that I had referenced from a couple of years ago, there's quite a lot of questions that were part of that poll that I just showed one slide from it, but basically, like, they asked in all sorts of different ways, like, you know, do you agree or disagree that, you know, like, should is now the time, transit should focus on just serving people who currently use transit versus like transit should be for everyone, or so I mean, very confident that users want an integrated system that like in a lot of different ways that was very clear from the poll, and that people are quite skeptical even when they put out the arguments that transit agencies use to oppose these. Those were not convincing arguments to them, in the sense that like people understood those arguments but didn't see those as reasons to not proceed with these things. A lot of the fears that are thrown out about like, well, there might, you know, people didn't really buy those arguments. I think a source of data that doesn't exist, that I know there's been experiments in other parts of the world, is like using cell phone data to like actually see what people are taking. Like, we know transit agencies have data on who's using transit and where they're going, but they don't have data on all the people that could be using transit or taking other modes of driving, and all the markets that transit could be serving. Like, I've never seen a very good analysis in the Bay Area of where should we be running more service where we're not, and there's a lot of people going to those areas. I hope that's part of this connected network plan that the region is starting to do, but Yeah, so I think those are the main areas. We don't do really our own user research, sources to that, but. What was your second? You had two questions.
No, like what else could we be studying?
Right. About users, yeah, that's a good question. I think, I mean, I have other research ideas, but I think on like user research, I think it's been always helpful to like qualitative research on people's desires. Like I think that type of research can be really expensive and laborious to do, but I think it can be really valuable and powerful to actually like to interview people who use transit and depend on transit and talk about how it affects their lives and actually package that in a way that tells a story. I think that valuable work to be done that hasn't really been done. Like it's very different from the polling that is easier to do. In back.
What are some of the experiences that the successful and seamlessly integrated transit agencies, what are some of the lived experiences they've had when it comes to finally receiving funding or approval from the state in order to create a seamlessly integrated transit network? Because as you've experienced right here, there's a lot of pushback from the different transit agencies, the very localized transit agencies that are resistant to change. What are some of the successes in Frankfurt, some of the successes in Switzerland? Yes.
Well, they've that Mineta report, which characteristics of high-ridership transit system metropolitan regions. That has a lot that's a resource I point that out. That talks about each of these big cities in more detail and some of the history and some of the, not so much about the politics, but I think some of the evolution of all of those systems. I mean, I think they've seen ridership. I mean, most importantly, they've seen ridership grow, and public support and satisfaction for transit go up. And that has been helpful for getting more money. It's been this like virtuous cycle of systems better, more people use it, it gets more funding, people are more encouraged to invest in it. So that's the like big picture story of, and what's been interesting in speaking to individuals who've been present for some of these transitions is they all say no one wanted to do it at first. Like that there was this idea that like all those places are different, you know, that like you're like this, every region struggles with this. And there is always an inclination for pushback, kind of fear of change, and then the common, this wasn't a question, but like money to fund the integration, money to guarantee people are not going to lose money off of this. Political champions, like there's a few recurring themes that have been like, well, how do these places get to there from here? There's been a few success factors, but as far as what are the positive outcomes they've seen? I mean, yeah, I don't know, just riders, more people using the system, a very popular system that is actually sustaining itself, you know, actually very high fare box recovery, interestingly, which is not a thing we necessarily aspire for, but people actually are willing to pay for the system with their fares, and that bringing in more fare revenue just further, you know, gives them even more money to invest in system expansion. Yeah.
Just bringing off that question, like I feel like all of these countries also have made it unfavorable to drive, basically. Like try to drive in London, it's a headache. You'd rather just walk to your destination. So I wonder like what people's reactions, like that general public poll you did where they're saying yes to transit, but how likely is it that they would say no to driving? I feel like that's where people get really defensive.
Yeah.
And you know, even if you improve transit service a lot, if the alternative is still good, people are still likely wrong for that. So is there any work around that on like, okay, you're willing for like better transit, but are you willing for like less of a good experience in driving?
My view on that, I agree with you that both of the things are important. I think, so my view on that is like, we focus on the improving transit part because I found it's hard to convince people to use their car less if they don't have a viable option, right? Like I think then this is the fundamental problem with trying to tell people to use their car less, is because many people don't have a good other option, and so I think it's not like a chicken and the egg, like you have to do both. You have to restrict parking, you have to make it more expensive, you have to do all these things. But honestly, it's way easier politically to build excitement and support for improving transit than it is restricting parking. And it's not to say we don't support it, but it's kind of, I feel like the parking stuff can come later or can come in separate initiatives. We don't need to condition improving transit on restricting parking. And hopefully if we have some victories and some like successes, some early with some things that people start to like change their perspective on transit, it'll become easier and easier to say, no, don't bring your car because you have a perfectly good other option. But I did when I worked for BARC, slight tangent, I oversaw 2 transit-oriented development projects in Eastern Contra Costa County. And one of the biggest obstacles when I would go out to public meetings, we were making the case for redeveloping parking lots and building housing, which involved reducing parking. And people were like, but there's no local transit here. Like the local buses to BART are so bad that it was very difficult to convince them. And it wasn't an illogical thing. Like if you're in their shoes to say, but I can't get to BART, or how am I supposed to get to BART if the local bus comes once an hour? Like that's not access. So if you're going to take away my parking spot without giving me more transit, like of course I'm going to oppose that. So that's a bit of an extreme example, but I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's we can't ignore. I think to think that we're going to achieve motion by just making it harder to drive it's politically actually almost impossible, because I think unless you're in San Francisco with places with quite plentiful transit service, that's a very difficult political battle. You're just going to end up driving the costs up for people who have no choice but to drive, including low-income people, and they're still not going to take the bus.
Yeah, that's good to hear. So based on this, and also, I know, for example, UK copied Curitiba, Brazil bus system, right?
Okay.
I don't see there's a lot of copying. They use like, no, we're so good, we're going to do it ourselves.
UK, you mean the United Kingdom?
Yeah. So I see like more sharing of. So there's the cultural part being like, we're the best we can do it. So there is an example that you mentioned that really, right? Freight, commercial, capitalism. We didn't really use that. You mentioned there's national freight planning, and there might be a state freight planning, like to prioritize, the logistics to merchandise getting there quickly. Maybe, there'll be some lessons learned on how to optimize, because you've got all the elements here. Like you showed that even people like BART, given the cheaper pass, would not prevent, it would still favor right now students, hopefully a bigger market, wanting to use that mode and every other agency. So I'm like making a business case, using what has worked to make freight so efficient. Is there any use of that? Any ally you could?
I'm not
bring
an
in?
expert on freight. Yeah, I don't.
It's really good transportation right there.
Yeah, I'm not sure how this applies to freight.
I think a lot of people who work in freight would say it's not highly efficient.
So you're saying, can you use the freight? I'm just trying to understand.
Maybe I'm jumping a bit here.
Compare, because freight is
There's like
relatively successful and nationally regulated and regionally integrated. Could you use the same arguments for why we should be doing
Yes,
public transit?
they
that
go
way?
through jurisdictions.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
have way of pass.
okay.
They have lots of.
Yeah, I don't know how much, who that resonates with. I mean, I think there's a logic there. I don't know if that helps convince anyone. if people are especially, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I try to sometimes use the an analogy of highway planning and highway construction to be like, well, we've designed our interstate system at a national scale, and we have Caltrans. No one questions that, like, we have a statewide agency with a ton of power and resources whose job is to make sure we can drive everywhere really easily and cheaply. So why is it crazy to think that we would have certainly a statewide agency who might do that for transit, let alone a regional agency? Like, why do we need to be doing this at the city, like at such a tiny micro scale, when it's just accepted and it's not at all controversial that Caltrans just does that? I mean, there's lots of problems with Caltrans. They're getting better, but anyway, I don't know if that resonates with any. We usually, unfortunately, that I've been accused by bringing up that example to say, oh, so what, you think Caltrans is so great? You think we should like compliment it? I've never heard anyone compliment Caltrans before, so I'm pointing out and trying to recreate Caltrans, but it is the logic of like, well, that level of like government, like the state being the state doing what the state should do and is uniquely positioned to do, which is oversee statewide systems. That's CalSTA is not really doing that when it comes to transit. They have a great statewide rail plan. They've got some good policies, but in my mind, there's a massive missing layer of government between the state and local jurisdictions. And again, if we were Europe, we would have all of these states within California, probably, where that, and we don't have that. We have just the gap between county governments and the state is huge, and the regional governments, including MTC, are very, they just don't have powers. They don't have local powers.
Let's go ahead and, I think there's a couple of online questions.
Oh, cool.
There is. First question. In Sonoma County, it costs $35 for each rider trip on the county buses. If we collapse the 27 transit districts and create just one, has anyone estimated how operational costs might be reduced?
$35 for the trip. Yeah, maybe it's hard. We want to see a consolidation study, so that is something we support. It's been kind of high level studied, but that is something that we think we're long overdue for. We're hopeful that the state legislature will ask that as one of the things. If there is money coming out of this current budget, we think that now whether 27 consolidating 27 makes sense, I doubt it, but certainly some consolidations do make sense. Barton Caltrain is the big one that I think, and based on our analysis, would have both operational efficiencies as well as a lot of positive impacts on our ability to do capital projects, our ability to run integrated service. So the one thing I'll say is that there was a study that MTC did during the last financial crisis in 2008 called the Transit Sustainability Project, TSP. That's a study to look up, and they did a lot of detailed analysis of how our administrative and overhead costs compare to other regions in the country. They did find that the Bay Area has not crazy costs, but higher costs administratively than peers in like Chicago or New York, which has like a highly centralized and much more centralized. So there's definitely some efficiencies, but it's not like the panacea that's going to like unlock all sorts of more money. Like it might save us 5% of our costs, but if you want to increase service by 30% to run more service, you're not going to find 30% savings by consolidating. You might make some better planning decisions though.
Yeah, there's another question. What steps are being taken to facilitate government employees to use transit? Are work schedules coordinated with transit schedules? Are managers and supervisors evaluated on how successful they are in encouraging employees to commute by other than solo driving?
Funny, this came up at lunch. I'm not aware very much that's there. I know there's obviously lots of employers provide like tax-free transit passes and subsidized transit passes. That's the main program that I'm aware of, and I'm sure most government agencies are using that. But beyond that, we were kind of brainstorming different things that the Bay Area could try to do this during transit month in September that might encourage transit agencies or public agencies to make commitments like that. I think that's a great idea.
I think it's time.
Yeah.
Couple minutes
And
left.
a little
so-
longer than I thought. But thank you for having me.
Well, thank you very much.